So let me go ahead and introduce our weirdest speaker that we've had here at Delhi, Greg Hand. And what to say about Greg Hand? He finds the weirdest stories in Cincinnati and brings them back. He's been curating a blog called Cincinnati Curiosities, which I think a lot of the stories he'll talk about tonight is from that blog and from his book. He's got books here for sale. So he's been doing that for a while. He regularly contributes to some of the news stations here in town, and he curates the weirdest people and the weirdest stories in Cincinnati. He's also a founder of something called Stand Up History, which is now an institution every third Wednesday of the month at Muse Cafe here on the West Side, and other various places throughout town. There's one coming up May 10th at the Observatory, which will be a lot of fun. And so without further ado, let's welcome Greg Hand.
Nice crowd here tonight. I got to check with the fire marshal. Find out what the capacity in a time machine is. Because today we are going to be traveling back into the past, into Cincinnati's past specifically. We're going to start out by talking about myths and facts. You know, you think of myths, Apollo, Zeus, Poseidon, those sorts of things, but myths are common to all of us. Myths are just the stories that we tell each other to feel good about what we're doing. And Cincinnati has some doozies. Our myths involve Ruth Lyons and Uncle Al, Gedda, WKRP, Fountain Square, Findlay Market, whether this is a rebuilding year for the Reds. Those are the sorts of myths that we tell one another. And over the years, in telling those myths, we've developed a sort of reputation. Online, there's this wonderful thing called the Urban Dictionary. And if you go to the Urban Dictionary and you look up our fair city, you see Cincinnati defined as a pleasantly bland and annoyingly conservative city that's inexpensive to live in, easy to get around in, and filled with neighborhood festivals. Horribly insular. Most people have never been outside the I-275 belt. Known for chili, Gedda, and please. Big on Catholic church festivals during the summers. And this is the reputation that we deserve because a lot of people have spent a lot of time developing exactly that reputation for our city. But if you go back into the past as we are tonight, you're going to discover that before 1900, this city would hardly be recognizable to anybody who is living today. To begin with, Porkopolis was not a compliment. The city got that reputation, at times slaughtering upwards of 500,000 pigs a year, pigs that were brought into the city on the hoof, pigs that were allowed to run loose in the city. There was no garbage collection in the city of Cincinnati until the 1870s because the pigs took care of everything. A lot of people have heard of Francis Fanny Trollope, who in 1832 wrote a book called The Domestic Manners of the Americans, in which she got revenge on Cincinnati for not supporting the bazaar that she created on 3rd Street. As part of her book, she says, if I determined to walk up Main Street. The chances were 500 to 1 against my reaching the shady side of the street without brushing by a snoot fresh dripping from the kennel. When we had screwed our courage to the enterprise of mounting a certain noble-looking Sugarloaf Hill, that would be Mount Adams, that promised pure air and a fine view, we found that the brook we had to cross at its foot, red with the stream from a pig slaughterhouse, while our noses, instead of meeting the thyme that loves the green hill's breast, were greeted by odors that I will not describe and which I heartily hope my readers cannot imagine. Few people can remember today, but Cincinnati used to hold public hangings at an execution yard on 5th Street, east of Walnut. The area that we now call Government Square had a gallows in permanent residence. Cincinnati Sheriff John Ludlow hanged a murderer by the name of James Mays as far back as 1792, just a few years after the city was settled. According to Greaves' centennial history, this hanging in 1792 was public, as all such affairs were at that time, and the people gathered from every direction to see it. Excursions were brought into the city, and many came from as far as 50 miles to be present. In addition to the gallows, Government Square boasted a whipping post, and Samuel Stitt, who was one of the pioneer settlers of Cincinnati, in his old age remembered, Levi McLean, the jailer, did the whipping. I saw a woman whipped for stealing. This McLean would get drunk, and in these frolics, he would amuse himself by whipping with a cowhide all the prisoners in the town jail, all around, debtors as well as criminals. Public hangings took place in Cincinnati until 1867, and hangings in general took place into the 1880s before they were moved up the road into Columbus. Anybody a big fan of horror movies? You know, it's like rule number 1 of a good horror movie: do not build your house on an Indian burial ground. You know? About every other horror movie is based on that premise. And in fact, the entire downtown of Cincinnati was built on what was essentially an Indian burial ground. The map that you see there is marked up with a bunch of red markings, and those indicate the earthworks that occupied downtown Cincinnati. The large circle there toward the bottom was a huge earthwork that basically circled what is now Fountain Square. When the first settlers arrived here, all of these earthworks were pretty much overgrown with trees, but as they cleared the area and took down the trees, they could see these mounds throughout the whole area. They were useful to a certain extent. Mad Anthony Wayne, who was in charge of Fort Washington for a while, took a young ensign by the name of William Henry Harrison around, and they cataloged the mounds that occupied Cincinnati to see which ones would be good for sentries and lookouts. About the only thing that remains of any of these downtown mounds is Mound Street. Mound Street is called Mound Street, amazingly, because there was a mound out there in the West End. And when Mound Street was being extended down to 5th Street, they did an excavation in which they found a mysterious object called the Cincinnati Tablet. I could probably spend the entire evening just going through the different theories of what the Cincinnati tablet is supposed to represent. Some of the early theories are that it's some sort of calendar, an astronomical chart. Some people believe that it is a fabric pattern that could be inked and placed on fabric. Some people said, well, if you can ink it and put it on fabric, you can ink it and put it on skin. It's what we would call a tattoo flash, where you would put the design on. There are some schools of New Age thought that believe that the Cincinnati tablet is actually the key to life, the universe, and everything. And they make pilgrimages to the Cincinnati Museum Center, where the original sits, and to the Cincinnati Art Museum, where a vintage replica exists. Speaking of strange artifacts, they don't come much stranger than a novel by the name of Edidorfa. Those of you who are classically trained or highly dyslexic realize that that is the word Aphrodite, spelled backwards. It is a novel written by a fellow named John Uri Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd made quite a fortune in pharmaceuticals. We will see a slide later that indicates one of his outstanding brands. And he used his time, his leisure, to write a variety of books, one of which was Edidorfa, which purports to relate the adventures of that bearded gentleman who is known as I Am the Man, who traveled into a cave in Kentucky, reached the center of the earth, and discovered the secrets to enlightenment and life, the universe, and everything, which seems to be a constant theme in Cincinnati. The illustrations for the theory that Lloyd was expounding actually has its home here in Cincinnati, and that is that the earth is hollow. How many people have been to Hamilton to see the Hollow Earth Monument? Got two. Okay, the photograph there is in fact the Hollow Earth Monument. This is a theory propounded by a person who is known as John Cleve Sims Jr., even though he was the nephew and not the son of the John Cleve Sims who purchased the Miami territories and that. He came up with this theory apparently after looking at images of Saturn through a telescope to suggest that the Earth was in fact hollow, and that there were several layers within the Earth, each of which had its own separate civilizations and cultures and that sort of thing. Sims' theory happened to be gaining popularity at about the time that a number of other cultural influences were starting to come together. Clement Moore's The Night Before Christmas poem, Thomas Nast's drawings, and somebody had to figure out, where does Santa Claus live? And apparently based on Sims' theory, people came up with this idea that Santa must live at the North Pole, because that's a nice, warm place, according to this theory. All from a crackpot idea developed in Cincinnati. Lloyd's book was illustrated by this chap, Augustus Knapp. Augustus Knapp was a theosophist, and the theosophists believed that they were descended from the alchemists of the Middle Ages, that they had uncovered the secrets that the alchemists collected from the ancient Egyptian mysteries, the ancient Hindu mysteries, whoever had mysteries, and created this convoluted sort of semi-religious cult. Theosophism was so popular in Cincinnati that in the 1890s, on 2 occasions, the National Theosophical Society meeting, their national convention, took place in Cincinnati. Augustus Knapp, by the way, the artwork there is his own artwork, was one of the founders of the Cincinnati Art Academy, which was staffed essentially by the board of directors of the local Theosophical Society. So yes, if you ever wonder why things are a little weird up in Mount Adams, Cincinnati newspapers were quite filled with stories about witchcraft, especially among the German population. The Germans really got into witchcraft. In 1883, for example, the Scheffler family, who lived on Bremen Street in Over the Rhine, ran down the road to the local police station, which undoubtedly is in Alan March's book, and begged for sanctuary from their neighbor in the tenement building where they lived up the street. Their home had been bewitched by a neighbor named Frau Landecker, who had cast spells on them through homemade potions. It appears the family had procured a variety of medicinal teas from their neighbor, Frau Landecker, and according to the Cincinnati Gazette, peculiar noises began to be heard about the house. Members of the family were unceremoniously jerked from their beds. Black and shadowy figures were seen as they glided past, and not only seen but felt as they took malicious enjoyment in pulling hair, pinching noses, jerking dresses, and such ghost-like pranks ad infinitum. Watch out for that herbal tea. Mysticism was a standard component of secret societies at the time. And in Cincinnati, if you were a man, you belonged to at least one secret society. Some of the more distinguished members of our community belonged to 6 or 7 secret societies. And if this gives you the impression that men were not often at home at night, you are correct. It was the ages before women's liberation, and once a man got done with work, he usually went right to the lodge meeting, if not to the lodge meeting, to a saloon. And to get into the society, usually had to go through some initiation that drew shamelessly from faux reports of Egyptian mysteries and Hindu mysteries and the same things that Theosophists were into. There were abundant secret societies that a person could join, including the Good Fellows, der Deutsche Orden der Harugari, the Druids, the Heptasophs, the Independent Order of Red Men, which is not to be confused with the Improved Order of Red Men, the Royal Arcanum, the Knights of Honor, the Knights and Ladies of the Golden Rule, the Independent Order of the Free Sons of Israel, the Order of the Iron Hall, the Fraternal Mystic Circle, the Sons of St. George, and the Order of the Golden Chain, and that's only 1 page out of 5 pages in the city directory for secret societies in 1890. Did Cincinnatians really believe this poppycock? You betcha. One of the most popular medicinal outlets in the entire Cincinnati area was just down the road in Cleves. The Walmsley family had for some decades owned and protected a madstone. A madstone was used in cases of a bite from a mad dog or from snake bite. And the way madstones were supposed to work is that they were applied to the bite, and if they adhered, that meant that there was poison in the wound, and they would stay attached to the wound until they fell off. When they fell off, they were boiled, usually in milk, and reapplied, and if they did not attach, it meant that all the poison was removed. And if they did attach, you'd keep them on, boil them again until a cure was effective. Madstones are biological products of ungulate animals, usually cows, but the most prized specimens come from albino deer. The Walmsley madstone traces back to a family in Boone County, Kentucky that had apparently killed an albino deer in the 1820s and procured this madstone, of which they gave a chip to the Walmsley family, who ate out on that for decades to come. As late as 1910, Cincinnati medical journals warned doctors against poo-pooing madstones, claiming, and again, this is 1910, they appeared to work. Phrenology. The belief that you can tell a person's personality by the bumps on their head is actually far deeper than that. Practicing phrenologists back in the 1900s believed that you could diagnose illness, that you could read a person's psychology. We had in Cincinnati our very own celebrity phrenologist. It's the gentleman with the distinguished mustache at the bottom. His name is Edgar C. Beale. Edgar Beale was such a popular phrenologist that he actually, and I believe this is mostly based on photographs rather than actual skulls, used to report regularly in the daily newspapers how to read skulls. So up in the corner you can see Edgar C. Beale's analysis of George Barnsdale Cox, the political boss of Cincinnati, who was known as Boss Cox. And according to Edgar Beale, Boss Cox had a very strong sex drive, which I'm sure amused the readers of the newspaper at the time. Eventually, Dr. Beale was kind of run out of town. People were okay with him fondling bumps on people's heads, but he wrote a sex manual, and that was entirely too much for the city of Cincinnati. The phrenology, though, was very much accepted, as I said, in Cincinnati. Here we have William Byrd Powell. When he was a phrenologist, and he taught phrenology as part of medical training. And when he died in the 1860s, in his will, he left his head to his favorite student. It specifies in his will that another student, specifically named, would surgically remove his head from his body and transmit it to his other student. And this was apparently the thing. If you were a phrenologist, you collected heads. There are a number of illustrations of phrenology offices with just rows of heads on things. The recipient of Bert Powell's head is Dr. Temperance Kinsey, who was among the first women physicians in Cincinnati. She practiced until into the 1890s, and amazingly, her will has no mention of what to do with the heads. Cincinnati also had its own voodoo king. This is King Prince Dawson, who was active in the city over a 20-year period. He had perhaps the most unique hairstyle in the city of Cincinnati in the entire 1900s, a sort of mohawk, blazingly white, and these mustaches that ran down to his chest. He claimed he was a voodoo king, and there weren't many people around to argue with him back then. He is known to be African American, probably a former slave, but he claimed his descent and his arcane knowledge through descent from a Shawnee medicine man. I'd mentioned theosophy and voodoo, witchcraft, and all these other sorts of things, and if none of them floated your boat, Cincinnati actually had a congregation of atheists. Now, they called themselves agnostics because you could just about be hanged for being an atheist. But the gentleman with his hands behind his back over there is a lawyer named Charles Sparks, who was the founder of Cincinnati's Agnostic Assembly. They did pretty much what churches did. They met every Sunday. A nice former Methodist ran their Sunday school. They had agnostic marriages, one of which took place in the Mercantile Library and was recorded by the New York Times. They had agnostic funerals, which absolutely scandalized the city, but it did provide an option at the far end of choice in Cincinnati. There are some people, though, for whom none of these things provided any solace, and they turned to suicide. Suicide was extremely common. If you read a Cincinnati newspaper and don't find a suicide on the front page, it's a very rare day. But the most amazing development, at least in my opinion, was the arrival about 1913 of Lysol in Cincinnati. Lysol was actually discovered in Germany back in the 1880s. And in Germany and on the continent, it became the #1 method of suicide for women at the time. By 1913, it was offered for sale in Cincinnati, and in that year, there were 10 suicides in Cincinnati from Lysol. But why go through all the trouble of getting poison? You could just kill yourself by living here. It may be a little difficult to see the boundaries outlined in the map there. This is based on a visit to our city in 1882 by an official of the United States Census Bureau named W.H. Baldwin. Baldwin took a look at sanitary systems in the city of Cincinnati. And he said the area bounded by Broadway, Freeman, Court Street, to the hills with a population of 80,000 people included only 30,000 who had connections to sewers. The rest of the people, the other 50,000 who lived in that area, used privy vaults. They had an outhouse in the backyard, and it had to be emptied. Most of them were not emptied, or if they were emptied by fly-by-night operators who would pull out all the waste from the privy vault and take them over to the next block and just dump it in the street. If they were honest and did what they were supposed to do, they took it down to the Ohio River and dumped it right near the water intake for Cincinnati's water supply. So if you want a more dramatic way out of here, you could just jump off a bridge. And in fact, as soon as the suspension bridge was built, suicides started occurring on a fairly regular basis, to the extent that every company who put up a bridge, and most of the bridges in Cincinnati were owned by companies at the time, had to set aside part of their returns from the tolls to pay for guards to keep people from jumping off the bridge. Especially this guy. That is an illustration of a man named Meredith Stanley. Meredith Stanley, on the 3rd of July in 1888, on a $5 bet, which was a good week's salary at the time, jumped off the suspension bridge into the Ohio River. He collected the bet and thought, it's a lot easier than painting houses. And for the next 10 or 15 years, that was Meredith Stanley's occupation. He would collect bets, jump off a bridge, win the bets, and he got paid at both sides. He got paid collecting the bets at the beginning, and then after he jumped, he would go on the vaudeville stage and talk about it, and get paid for doing that. The Highland House up at the top of Mount Adams actually set up a large diving board so that Stanley could demonstrate how to jump into shallow pools of water. His major accomplishment, however, is deciding that the Ohio River bridges were too tame. He took the train down south of Lexington to the Kentucky River, where, I need to verify the height of this thing, 285 feet above the Kentucky River, which was 12 feet deep. Meredith Stanley jumped off the high bridge, survived, and took the train back to Cincinnati that evening. Eventually, people got tired of paying people to jump off bridges, and he had to get a real job. Since height didn't seem to bother him, he became a steeplejack. He was painting the smokestack at a laundry factory in the Mohawk area and fell to his death at age 60. In addition to bridge jumpers, there were some amazing things in the sky. In 1898, on the 2nd of December, 6 men, all residents of Lockland, stood on a street corner waiting for the Mill Creek Valley streetcar to take them into town to their jobs. As they were chatting, they looked up, and according to the newspaper, to the great astonishment of the observers, they perceived in the dim, misty light a curious object that was traveling at a high rate of speed in a southeasterly direction. The mysterious thing was egg-shaped, Although its exact line were partially obscured by the mist, it emerged from the gloom in the north. The object was enveloped in a faint light, and at an even distance on each side of it, two small but dazzling lights kept the main object company. This was almost 5 years to the day before the Wright brothers launched their plane at Kitty Hawk. And they were not drinking. Although everybody else in Cincinnati was drinking.
Today's the 100th anniversary of the Titanic.
Boy, did they drink then. A reporter for the Cincinnati Commercial once wandered through the city collecting stories about the champion drinkers in Cincinnati. He was at the J.G. Sohn and Company Brewery. It's over in the Mohawk area again. He learned about one Dr. Neffler, who was a guest of Johann Sohn, the owner of the brewery. They were sitting at dinner. Dr. Neffler drank an entire 8-gallon barrel of beer in a 2-hour period. There was a horse trader at Elm and Elder Street, a guy named Henry Deilicht. He was famous in the neighborhood because every single day he drank 100 glasses of beer. This added up to something like 9 gallons a day. Now, Cincinnatians drank more beer, but they drank more of everything. The first record of the word cocktail in Cincinnati appears in 1855. And the article that describes this new drink, this new fashion coming in from the East, explained this is exactly the sort of thing you need to get your appetite going when you wake up in the morning. Before 1920, in Cincinnati, there was no such thing as an illegal drug. You could go down to the corner pharmacy and buy opium. You could buy all sorts of things. Even though there was nothing technically illegal about it, it was one of those things where the cops, if you kind of got out of hand at the opium joint, they would bust you. One of the big exposés, and this is an illustration of it from the Cincinnati Enquirer, is folks were whispering about this Cincinnati business executive who took his female assistant to this house on Court Street near Central Avenue. And they assumed that hanky-panky was taking place. Well, it turned out that their visits had nothing to do with sex. They were both opium addicts. And this was the place they would go for what was known as the long draw. Marijuana, totally legal in Cincinnati. And again, you could buy it at the pharmacy. The ad here for hashish candy is sort of a Civil War vintage advertisement from a Cincinnati newspaper. Today we would call those edibles. You can see some antique labels for cannabis extract over on the side. If you've got really good eyes, you will see that the manufacturer of the cannabis extract was the same John Uri Lloyd who wrote that weird book about going to the center of the earth and seeing the products his company produced. You may wonder where he got his inspiration. The drug of choice for Cincinnati, though, was tobacco. And tobacco, specifically in the 1800s, meant two forms of tobacco: chewing or cigars. Mostly chewing. The men of Cincinnati were such inveterate tobacco chewers that every public room, most private rooms, had to have a spittoon around. Simply because if you didn't, you'd have to pay to get your carpets cleaned. This habit was so extreme that when the brand new Burnett House opened, at the corner of 3rd and Vine, the most magnificent hotel in that time in the United States, they had to have a crew with hoses to wash down the marble staircases every morning from the tobacco effluvia running and staining the marble steps. So, whether it was all that marijuana or whatever, but Cincinnati absolutely had a case of the munchies. We were still getting used to having a professional baseball team when we had professional grub punishers. That was the term they used for these folks. People who could eat enormous amounts of food. One of them, pictured here, is a guy named Joe Ruff, who could not find a boarding house to live at because he kept eating his landladies out of house and home. Joe was once evicted after he ate 18 of the 20 ears of corn his landlady had cooked for all of the residents. It was quite common for Joe, mostly on bar bets, to eat 50 eggs at a single sitting, shells and all. There was a butcher named John Menzel who kept a stand at the Court Street Market, and the vendors there were talking about different champion eaters, and Menzel bragged that he had once eaten 10 pounds of ham, 5 dozen eggs, fried potatoes, 18 biscuits, and 7 cups of coffee for breakfast one day. His co-workers called Bullpucky, and a bet was arranged. They decided, just to keep things simple, they're going to leave out the potatoes and the biscuits, just 10 pounds of ham and 60 fried eggs. Menzel devoured it in 10 minutes, bone and all. Now, the biggest exposition of gluttony in this city was the annual Christmas meat parade. These are the days before refrigeration of any sort. And so if you were going to buy meat, you bought it the day you were going to cook it. And everybody wanted to serve meat at Christmas. And so the 5th Street Butchers organized the Christmas meat parade. On Christmas Eve, they would line up all of the animals that were going to be brought down to their booths for slaughter. They would intersperse them with military marching bands, and they would have a parade that started way out by Mohawk and came down the canal and toward 5th Street. According to one report, this parade included 66 bullocks, of which probably 3/4 were raised and fed in Kentucky, and the residue in our own state. 125 sheep hung up at the edges of the stalls, 350 pigs displayed in rows on platforms, 10 of the finest and fattest bears produced in the state of Missouri, and 1 buffalo calf weighing 500 pounds caught in Santa Fe. Merry Christmas. Over in the West End, Cincinnati, Dan was just waiting for this one, had its own meat parade. We had our own red light district. Dan and I often present together, and usually he knows eventually I'm going to get into the ladies of the evening. This is a map of George Street, a street that essentially no longer exists. There's a block of George Street tucked in back of the Bell Telephone building between Race and Elm, I guess. But George Street used to go way out into the West End. The map is showing Plum Street out to Mound Street, so we've got Plum, Central, Smith, and John. What you are looking at, the buildings marked in red are brothels. The buildings marked in green are saloons. On that stretch of George Street, there are 46 brothels, each one containing an average of 5 to 10 prostitutes. Prostitution was not legal in Cincinnati, but the city kept it confined in what they called the segregated district to keep it from infecting the rest of the city. And because it was kept in this district, they kept everybody out of this district. The number one group that they kept out were missionaries. Who were always interested in heading into the red light district to save somebody's soul, but the police realized that if those houses shut down, their weekly bribe would disappear, their lieutenant's weekly bribe would disappear, the city councilman's bribe would disappear, the mayor's bribe would disappear, and most importantly, George Barnsdale Cox's bribe would disappear. And so they kept the business operating until the federal government shut down all segregated districts in the United States as a precautionary measure during World War I. Many of the buildings in that red light district were just rented by the madams who operated them. One of the largest landowners in the West End was a guy named William P. DeVue. He was legendary for buying up properties like a hoarder would buy up books or record albums or something like that, and believed that he could take care of them himself. And so he never hired any repair people, even though he owned upwards of 200 pieces of property. DeVue was known for riding a white horse through the red light district once a month, collecting his rents, which were printed on two sides. On the front side was a receipt for your rent that month, and on the opposite side was an eviction notice if you didn't have your rent that month. Even though these buildings had to be maintained really by the tenants, and so when you read about these elaborate brothels, it's the madams who are paying for the improvements. DeVue came up with tons and tons of money, which on his death, he left to the city of Covington to create a park called the Cincinnati Post in 1937 says, "It seems rather amusing for these unspeakable houses in Cincinnati's West End to keep on producing rents for the upkeep of trees and flowers in Covington." So as I said, unless the houses got out of hand, the police kind of looked the other way. They were very concerned, however, with one institution of immorality in Cincinnati, which was the public library. The etiquette of the day, the manners of the day, require that men and women be separated. And in the library, there was just too much temptation for men and women not to be separated. It got to the point where the guardians at the library were separating husbands from wives, that sort of thing. There was a desk for women to provide service and one for men. There was a letter, 1874, to the Cincinnati Enquirer from a correspondent who blames Thomas Vickers, who was the head of the library at the time. I am able to prove that the library building is frequented by prostitutes and that it is used as a place of assignation by young girls. It is a general rendezvous for people who are on the loose. I know of a number of young men who boast of the facility with which the library has afforded them in their nefarious business, all under the administration of the austere Vickers. Well, however immoral the library was, just up the street, Cincinnati, for 50 years, promoted female nudity on stage. This was in the form of a production called Tableaux Vivants, or living pictures. And the idea is kind of demonstrated in that illustration, is that on stage, a woman or women in an extreme state of undress would pose to represent a famous painting, while an orchestra played a soundtrack appropriate to that image. Not only was this approved in the city, it was actually promoted in the city. The newspapers did reviews of tableaux vivants, or living pictures, and they mentioned this is the way to introduce people to the finer arts. So while that was going on stage, we had another problem. This involved male nudity in the canal. As early as 1828, the city of Cincinnati passed a law, and I quote, "Whereas much lewdness and obscenity daily occur from the public and lascivious manner in which men and boys expose themselves in bathing at the Miami Canal in the city of Cincinnati." By the late 1800s, naked men were still a matter of discussion in the city. The Cincinnati Post in 1894 said, "People in the vicinity of the city hospital are up in arms. Every day for 2 weeks past, nude boys and men have been swimming in the canal, some of them 20 years old. Wednesday, a crowd of boys were swimming and standing about the canal bank at the bridge at 12th and Plum Streets. Crowded streetcars pass over this bridge every few minutes." So, naked men weren't the only things you found in Cincinnati waterways. We also have sea monsters. On the 11th of January, 1878, Ben Carrick, who was a delivery man, was driving his wagon across the suspension bridge just as the sun was coming up, when he saw what he described to the Cincinnati Gazette. Protruding from the water some 12 or 15 feet was what seemed to be the head of a huge serpent or animal that was rushing through the water at a very rapid rate and occasionally lashing the water with its tail into a perfect foam. Carrick told the newspaper that the beast made a noise similar to the deep lowing of a cow, interspersed with a loud hissing noise. There were a half a dozen sea monster sightings in the Ohio River during the next 5 years. Even though no one ever caught an actual sea monster, during this period, there were actual captures of alligators on the Covington side of the river. We also had monsters on land. You know, in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was very popular all over the United States. But in Cincinnati, it had a particularly interesting role. The Ku Klux Klan ran a clothing store. It was called Ku Klux Clothes. This is part of its ad. It was at Main Street and 4th Street. Its motto was one price, one profit. The price was $33 for a man's suit. If you translate that through inflation, that's about $450. So, you know, it's not Armani, but it's not Big Lots.
Do you remember a clothing store down there called Ben's?
Cincinnati had all sorts of awful stuff. Candy, for instance.
Down by City Hall.
Well into the 1900s, before the city of Cincinnati finally established a health department, there were no laws on the books against contaminating candy. Cincinnati confectioners regularly sold candy that was poison. They dyed the candy with lead, mercury, cobalt, and even arsenic. The newspapers would run editorials around Christmas time, basically saying, avoid the green stuff. No one knows what's in that stuff. Some of the safest candy available in Cincinnati during the 1800s, the sugar was cut with either plaster of Paris or gypsum. Chocolates were mixed with fat that was rendered from animals that were picked up from the streets. And somehow we survived. And since we're talking about surviving and death, let's end tonight with the Death family. Cincinnati actually had a family of deaths. Very distinguished family, actually. This is the wedding certificate, marriage certificate for one of the Death family, a lady who I believe has the most goth name ever recorded in Cincinnati, Arachne Death. Arachne Death. Arachne's father, charming fellow, was Mr. Absalom Death. Believe it or not, Mr. Absalom Death, for several years, was the director of the city hospital. In addition to his public service, Mr. Death was a purveyor of rectified whiskey. There is I'm stepping into Molly's territory. There is a wonderful book out there called Cincinnati Yesterdays, published in the 1960s by a gentleman who grew up in the West End, and he describes a lot of this stuff. Here's how William Smith describes rectified whiskey. Such compounds often consisted of alcohol, distilled water, burnt sugar for coloring, beet oil, and rye or bourbon flavoring. In rare cases in which the compounder was squeamish or even honest, a modicum of good whiskey was added, assisted by a little glycerin or castor oil to take the scratch out of the alcohol. So here's Mr. Death, who is selling rectified whiskey, and you can picture this, that he has a shop on Main Street, and on the shop there's a sign that hangs out toward the street, and it says, rectified whiskey, Absalom Death. And the story goes that a nearsighted woman from out in the country had come in to do some shopping in town and was on her way out up Main Street. And she saw that sign and turned to her son, who had the reins, and said, "Johnny, stop! Rectified whiskey, absolute death. There's one honest man in Cincinnati, and I want to see what he looks like." Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's asking about somebody named Cunningham. Old Cunny. Old Cunny. Back in the 1800s, Cincinnati had 9 medical schools. 9 medical schools. And each one taught a different type of medicine. So there was homeopathic, there were botanicals, there were eclectics, and they all needed bodies to study anatomy. But it was illegal to leave your body, basically, to medicine. And so what these schools would do is they would hire resurrectionists. Old Cunny was one of them, who would go to graveyards, find fresh burials, dig them up, bring them to the back door of the medical schools where they had chutes that resurrectionists could dump bodies into. And then they would show up on the dissecting table the next day. Old Cunny was so famous that mothers used to tell their children, "You behave yourself or Old Cunny's going to get you." He eventually died, and his wife sold his body to the medical school for $10.
Did they fill the hole back then?
No, what they would do is they didn't, it's a waste of time to dig up the whole thing. They would burrow down toward the head and run a hook down and pull you up by your neck through this small hole. Yeah.
Thank you.